Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of The Conscious Capitalists with myself, Timothy Henry, and my partner in making the world a better place through business, Raj Sisodia.
Hey, Timothy. Good to see you.
Good to see you. And today we have a guest who brings up a very topical question or issue around employee ownership and how do we work on developing or addressing the wealth inequality gap that we've got in America. So I would like to welcome Loren Rodgers, who's the executive director of the National Center for Employee Ownership. The organization is the country's foremost nonprofit dedicated to expanding and strengthening employee ownership. But I would argue that he is one of the world's leading experts on the subject himself. He joined NCEO in 2005 as a research director, and he's led the organization since 2011, guiding a membership of over 1,700 companies. They've got a staff of 20, and he holds a master's degree in public policy from the University of Michigan. He serves as a visiting executive fellow at Rodgers University's Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing. He also serves on the board of several nonprofits and employee-owned companies. And as I said, there are a few people in the world who know the employee ownership world as well as Loren does. Loren, it's a pleasure to have you join us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Timothy. And wow, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And hi, Raj.
Hi.
Well, a colleague and I had the honor and privilege of joining the NCEO annual conference in Milwaukee this year. And we really got exposed to over 2,000 people in your movement who are keen on this idea of employee ownership. So maybe let's start there. People are keen on this idea of employee ownership. Give us the basics of the ESOP world in which you live.
Sure. So I think it's a different case depending on who you're making the case to. For the policymaker, it's the case of how much social good it does. It does some massive good for communities. It roots capital in those communities. From an employee perspective, it's pretty much a clear win. Employee-owned companies generate a whole lot more wealth and share that wealth with employees. So when you survey like a random section of the workforce, employee owners have about 92% greater net household wealth than non-employee owners. And that goes along with other kind of quality of work-life things like tuition reimbursement and flex time and parental leave. So from an employee perspective, it's pretty clearly a good thing. From a social benefit perspective, it's a good thing. Interestingly, it's also a really good thing for the companies themselves. There's some great new research that I think we'll talk about a little bit later, but the companies do better, which is what makes it possible for employees and the society as a whole, and the sellers, the people who sell their businesses to the employees, to also do well. It turns into a win-win-win-win situation.
So what I'm always amazed by is, okay, we've got the data, and I mean, just a simple piece of data, which was about, bank defaults for loans to employee-owned businesses. And it was a minuscule level versus a normal bank loan to a normal business. And I was wondering, well, why aren't all the banks in the world like piling in to want to lend to employee-owned businesses? And, and you mentioned, look, there's performance data and these things. So what is getting in the way? I mean, the business case can be made for this. The public benefit case can be made for it. The closing the wealth gap, which is a major social issue in America, can be made. Why isn't it more widespread? What's going on in that space?
Yeah, that's a perceptive question, Timothy. In my mind, there are two main things going on. Sort of the starting point is that if you've built a company, you've created it, you've invested decades of your life into it, people tend to be really conservative about what happens to it next, about what happens to preserving their legacy and the well-being of all the people who helped them build the business. So people tend to be pretty risk averse. And it doesn't take too much for something which maybe people haven't heard about too often, like employee ownership, to feel risky. There's one spectacular bad case of employee ownership when United Airlines did an experiment with employee ownership that worked really well for a long time. But for a whole bunch of reasons, that ended up not working out so well. And I think that one single instance has convinced a lot of sellers that it's a risky thing for them, despite the data that you mentioned, Timothy, the default rate and the enhanced performance that happens in the average employee-owned company indicates that it's actually a lot less risky than other ways of owning a business. So that's one thing. I think there's sort of a background of caution when it comes to who owns your business after you. And then the second thing is that for a lot of the professionals who help a business owner choose who's going to own the business after him or her, those professionals have a profit motive to do something where there's a nice big success fee. And often that success fee, the ratio of fee to amount of work put in, can often be higher with forms of exits that are different than an employee ownership plan.
Even the private equity business is getting involved with this. We've had Pete Stravos on talking about the work they're doing at KKR. We'll be having the director of Ownership Works on talking about how they're trying to mobilize private equity and employee ownership. How do you feel about that? I mean, you've been around the movement for a long time, and now suddenly it's in a certain crowd becoming quite popular to talk about it.
It is tricky. I don't think there's any way to say that when private equity gets involved in something, it doesn't get a bit tricky. My perspective is that as a whole, private equity has not been good for our economy. There are lots of examples of that. But I think with private equity, as with any other form of business transaction, any other form of anything really, there are good examples and bad examples. So I think if to the extent you've got to look case by case at what Ownership Works is doing, at the individual transactions it's working on, you've got to look at all of the things that KKR and the other firms are looking at and say, hey, in this case, is this more like a private equity transactions that makes people uncomfortable, that doesn't create the best interest? Or is this a form of a private equity transaction in which the workers really are benefiting? What would have happened to the workers in a KKR or an Ownership Works transaction if somebody else had bought it, or if nobody had bought it? I think that's the right question.
Well, that leads to the sort of the cause and effect question, which I find fascinating because you differentiate between being an employee-owned business from a transaction point of view, but more importantly, the value really being created when you do it culturally, when you move to this feels like the employees are treated as owners and they feel that versus, yes, on paper.
Yeah, that's right. And it's true that one of the things I love about my work is some of it is really nitty-gritty technical, how transactions are structured. And a lot of employee ownership is about that. But then you're right, Timothy, a lot of it is about ownership culture. And I was about to say the kind of squishy idea of ownership culture. But I think people are maybe a little too quick to think of culture as being squishy. There are a lot of ways to make it more precise and measurable. There are good surveys. We've got an employee survey that hundreds of employee-owned companies have used to help get a sense for what makes an ownership culture. And there are also some very non-squishy things that are essential in making a culture strong. That's things like having clear decision-making boundaries, having people get basic business literacy and in business in general and about their own particular company so that they can be an informed contributor to making the company collectively succeed. I think another part of culture is accountability. And people think of accountability as almost a threat, something threatening. It's something that if you're held accountable, it means that you're on the line. And that's true to some extent, but it's also the case that if you're accountable for something, that means you've got the authority to do something about it. And I think that idea of accountability, people should think of that as a very two-sided thing. It's something that we need to use carefully, but it's also a tool to making people really engaged as part of their workforce. One of our member companies gives every one of their employee owners a little physical card. It's the size of a driver's license, and it's called a license to act, because they want people to get that connection, that not only do they have accountability for coming up with good ideas for the company, but they've got the authority to do that as well.
So, Loren, the benefit to employees obviously is quite self-evident, and you've shared some of that data already. What about the business case? I know that Ownership Works provides some data on that. Have you all done analysis on that as well, that the business actually performs better, grows faster, is more innovative, etc.? What kind of further evidence that can you provide on that?
Yeah, sure. So there's let me just step back for one scene setting point, which is that in the United States, the most common form of employee ownership is the employee stock ownership plan, the ESOP. But there are several other forms of employee ownership. And Rod, your question about Ownership Works is a broad-based equity compensation. So that's distinct from an ESOP. The data that Ownership Works is creating is a real contribution to the field because it's different. It's compelling. It's strong. There are other forms of employee ownership, such as the recently emerging employee ownership trust, for which there's just not data yet. There are also worker cooperatives, and our colleagues over at the Democracy at Work Institute have been collecting some good data on that, finding some really compelling results. But I'll stick with ESOPs because that's where the best research data is. ESOPs have been around since 1974, at least as a legislatively codified entity. So we've got decades of data on them. And there's really good data stretching all the way back to the founding of ESOPs about the productivity benefits of adopting an ESOP, including the benefits to revenue growth per year, employee growth per year. But I think the most exciting thing is actually a study that came out just a couple months ago. So there's a new paper that came out in March 2026 by Ferdan Kurtulis and some other authors. It's called Employee Ownership, Management Practices, and Labor Productivity. And the unique thing they did was they took 3 databases, all of which are federal restricted databases that you can't get to without a security clearance. So it's been impossible before they pulled this off to link those 3 databases, but they did that. So they got some really impressive data that measures engagement and culture, productivity, and the extent to which a company is employee-owned. And they found a huge number of results. This was specific to the manufacturing sector, but it's not a sample. It's the manufacturing sector. And what they found is if you compare over a 5-year gap between 2010 and 2015, that the companies that became employee-owned in that period saw their productivity jump by between 5.6 and 6.7% on average. If you think about that amount compounding over time, it leads to a huge business case for the impact of employee ownership. And that productivity gap is the magic that makes it possible for this to be a win-win-win-win situation.
And I suspect that the productivity metric might understate the case because that's measuring efficiency and output. When you start measuring the qualitative things, the effectiveness, the creativity, that probably increases as well.
Yeah, right on, Raj. That's an excellent point. And it also mirrors back because it doesn't measure all those non-financial things. So the benefit is bigger, as you said. But also those non-financial things like building a culture, actually, they found drive companies to have higher than average productivity effects. So they found that companies that do systematic participation and business literacy training were on the higher end of the productivity impact, or even beyond the higher end of the average of the productivity effect. So you end up with this virtuous cycle where companies create more productivity. That productivity creates better outcomes in financial and non-financial terms, which then cycles back to add even more productivity to the company.
And it probably reduces employee turnover quite a bit as well, dramatically probably.
Yes, that's
which
right.
is a huge cost.
There's some good data which was collected by the General Social Survey. It's a federally sponsored survey run by the University of Illinois. And they found turnover, both voluntary and involuntary, among employee-owned companies that were almost ridiculously lower than the non-employee-owned companies. It was the turnover rates for both voluntary and involuntary were often a quarter of the rates of the non-employee-owned companies. So yeah, I think you're right, Raj. I mean, people often think of the benefit of employee ownership as coming from employees working harder and smarter, and that's true. But it also comes, as you said, from them having to spend a lot less time and money on recruiting, on not losing excellent employees. And it also comes from good governance. Employee-owned companies need to have better governance. And I think that's one of the quiet paths, the things that people don't talk about as much, that lead to their better performance over time.
Well, that's interesting because I often hear, the rumor on the street, the governance for an employee-owned business is challenging and difficult. Now you're playing the counterpoint, which actually one of the benefits is cleaner, better governance. Maybe talk about that a little bit in terms of a counterintuitive point that.
I think that good governance pays off. It ain't cheap. It takes time. To do it right, you really need dedicated focus from core leaders of the team. But I think it works. I think if you've got a governance process that can prevent the companies from making a single mistake, that pays off in far larger terms. I've seen this again and again where companies have either realized an opportunity because they had a good governance structure. And maybe it's not even the governance structure itself that's causing that outcome. Maybe it's the need to prepare, say, a report to the board that systematically goes through and sees how the company's doing relative to a strategic plan. Or maybe it's actually developing that strategic plan in the first place. Some companies don't really bother to do it or to use it unless they've got the good governance practices in place to make sure that they not only create a strategic plan in the first place, but then actually use it. There are two reasons it's better in an employee-owned company. One is that employee-owned companies are required by federal law to do some good governance processes. They need to create a 5-year projection every year for how they're going to do. You can't really do that without a strategic plan. They need to create that 5-year projection because they need to give it to the outside appraiser who's going to value their shares. And it's not possible to do an accurate appraisal of shares without a projection over time. The better a job they do with that projection, the more weight it gets in future years. So they got an incentive not only to create a credible plan, but to stick with it. The other reason that employee-owned companies are more likely to have good governance is that more and more the professional trustees who often govern the trust that owns the shares on behalf of employees in an ESOP are increasingly insisting on having outside independent directors and a whole suite of good governance practices adopted at the same time that the ESOP is created. In fact, just knowing that that's going to happen leads a lot of companies to clean up their governance processes in the years immediately prior to becoming employee-owned. And just overall, one of our member companies, they put together a fairly expensive wellness program. And the CEO was talking about it. He was saying, I think it pencils out in dollars and cents, but I'm not sure. But I know it's benefiting the employees, and those are my shareholders. So that's a quiet, non-legal way that it's changing the thinking of the CEO about who the company is for.
And Loren, when we talk about employee ownership, do we distinguish between a company where it might be 10, 15% of the company is owned by the employees versus all the way to 100%? What's the difference when you go on that spectrum? Does it dramatically change?
It does, yeah. So I think it's good to think of there being sort of a two-level definition of employee ownership. There's sort of a broad outer definition. I think any company in which there's some ownership or ownership rights that are legally defensible and in the name of employees for employee interest, that's broad-based, and that is designed to improve employee well-being, that deserves to be in the conversation about employee ownership. Once you're in the conversation, the more best practices you do, the more employee-owned you are. And that includes things like participation, voice for employees, business literacy, ownership culture, wealth building. So, and the greater the percentage shares owned by a company, the more employee-owned they are. And the research on that is really good, that the greater the value in an ESOP account, the greater the shares the greater the financial benefit employees get, the larger the performance improvement.
And is there then, do we have board representation for employees in companies where there's a high percentage of ownership?
That is, interestingly, there's a wide variety of approaches to that. Most of our member companies don't have an employee designated to serve on their boards. And a number of companies that have implemented that process have actually backed away from it eventually. They've decided that the ideal role for employees is not to have that literal legal fiduciary responsibility of being on the board, but to have a structured approach to getting employees' input in the ways that make most sense on the things they know most about, and that the board is better off with expertise that draws from around the entire industry, or a deep dive on something specific like technology or marketing.
Now, when we talked to Pete, there was a very personal story behind why he became passionate about this subject, having to do with his father, who had worked his whole life and really accumulated nothing at the end of it. What brought you into this world? How did you find your way into employee ownership, and what was the motivation, the inspiration, and what has kept you in it for decades?
Wow. Okay. I can't top Pete. He's got a very personal family story. For me, my entry into this field is all about the success of an undergraduate education. I took a course in alternative business structures as an undergrad at the University of Michigan. And one of the things we spoke about was employee ownership. I completely forgot about the course until 4 years later, when I was living in the Czech Republic, trying to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. And I really wanted to do something that was a combination of very idealistic, transformative to the economic structures of the world. I was in a country that just a couple of years prior had been communist, and seeing the boundless energy that was unlocked and maybe not yet focused in a post-communist country. So I was very interested in doing something that had a transformative effect, but also something that was, this will sound a little corny, but uncorruptible. Employee ownership makes a positive difference in individuals' lives, even in just a single transaction. Even if there's no further transformation of the economy, a single employee-owned business makes single employees' lives better.
That appealed to something inside you? I mean, were you an idealistic kid? Like, what was other people see that and they don't do what you did.
Yeah. I think I was just exceptionally lucky to have a drive and be so fortunate to be in a place where the next step in my life, which was grad school, was a perfect place to explore that. If it had happened at a different time in my life, I probably would have needed to keep working or doing something else. So I think I just got mighty lucky with the timing at which this inspiration came to me. And then got very lucky again once I finished my master's degree to be able to find a job in a field which is not nearly as large as it should be.
So you've made the case for the employees. Now and we touched on it, but I want to come back to it. I'm an owner. I've put my heart and my soul into my business. And now I'm coming to a point where I want to have a transition. And as I think about the transition, there'll be people knocking on my door saying, sell it to a strategic buyer, sell it to maybe private equity, or fewer, and that's part of the problem, coming and saying, hey, sell it to your employees. What in the end gets me over there to the sell it to my employees? And what do you notice about those types of leaders?
A two-part question. I think there's sort of a threshold minimum dollar amount that many people need to have, and they've just got to get there for the good of their family before they can consider anything else. So that's their first screen, and that's one place where I think employee ownership has quite a failing, because I think this will sound a little perverse, but one of the problems with employee ownership is the costs of the transaction are really transparent. So people know how long it's going to take. They know how much it's going to cost to put an ESOP in place. If they're looking at a third-party buyer, those third-party buyers have gotten really good at not making the costs transparent up front. There's going to be a lot that's hidden in the cost of the transaction that shows up later. And so we actually just released a paper on this. And so at the end of the day, and here again, I'm just talking about ESOPs where the data is best. The cost of an ESOP transaction is usually between 2 and 4% of the value of the transaction. But when all the dust is settled, the cost of a third-party buyer is more often between 4 and 9% of the transaction. And the average buyer doesn't know that until it's too late and they're pretty far down the path towards selling to whoever they're going to sell to. So that's one piece. I think employee ownership needs to get past this. Is it enough money for me to meet my minimum family needs? Once it does, then I think the reasons that sellers choose to do it are as varied as the sellers. I like to think of it as sellers are writing the next chapter in the book of their history of life. And for a lot of the people who choose employee ownership, they're thinking to themselves, now, what kind of a chapter am I going to be happy telling my grandkids about? And, maybe that's a chapter about protecting the well-being of the people who helped me build this community. Or maybe it's going to be about keeping a thriving business in the community where it's currently an anchor of the economy. Or maybe it's about the legacy or the relationships that this company has built with other companies, its vendors, its suppliers, its customers. So I think there are all sorts of different stories that people tell themselves, but I think it's that two-part thing: money, and then some values-based question.
So I want to pull on that string of the values-based a little bit more, because the premise we have in working more closely together with the employee-owned community is that what we share in common is values-based leadership. That for a significant percentage of employee-owned businesses, you have values-based leaders, and therefore people that will resonate with our message around conscious capitalism. But it raises an interesting question, which is the development of leaders who can lead employee-owned businesses, because that's a slightly different set than somebody who could lead a third-party organization where the command and control is still in place. Now, in an employee-owned business, there's a little bit more diffusion of that top-down hierarchy. So I wonder what your perception is in terms of the development of the leaders who lead these kind of businesses well.
I think you're right that that's a really good overlap between what we all do. I think that's the heart of it. And I mentioned that the advantage of employee ownership may be around working harder, good governance, and then all that goes into that. But maybe it's also about grooming and choosing leaders, preparing leaders to be leaders. One thing I've noticed, and I think that's really common with conscious capitalism, is that the CEOs and other leaders of employee-owned companies love to talk with each other. I think having them gather and share ideas and cultivate each other and have their successors meet groups of other CEOs has been one of the transformative aspects of the field of employee ownership. We have groups of CEOs who form regular cohorts and talk with each other. The University of Pennsylvania has a program for CEOs of ESOP companies. There's a lot of infrastructure to allow companies to develop their leaders, and that extends far, far down. One of our most prolific members is a company called Springfield Remanufacturing Corporation, SRC. And they've developed a program where every single employee to whom anybody reports develops their own succession plan. Not just the CEO, not just the C-suite, everybody who supervises anybody. And that leads to an entire culture where leaders are being built and cultivated consciously and planfully across the entire sweep of the organization.
One of the things that is now coming up is this this acronym. I think it's called AI. May have heard a little bit about that. And I bring that up in two contexts. One is, we start talking about productivity gains and improvements. And clearly one of the promises or threats, depending on how you look at it, for AI is significant productivity improvements in terms of speed, efficiency, and accuracy of some types of work. There's also a debate that seems to be coming up about the wealth creation that's happening with AI and how to make that more widespread in society. And I'll use a funny example because there's this big IPO going on right now for SpaceX, and a good deal of what SpaceX valuation is around AI. And the headline is 4,000 millionaires created. And I'm looking at the other side of it, of the 60-70% of Americans who don't feel that business is working to their benefit, who feel they're under significant financial pressure right now. And then they're reading this headline of 4,000 new millionaires and the disconnect between the wealth creation that's being concentrated in some of these AI-related businesses and what we do about that, because it's going to exacerbate a problem that we already have, which is there's this incredible wealth inequality in America. Perspective on AI. Frame it for us, Loren.
I don't know if I can give a lot of optimism here. But one thing that I think is really interesting that the first strikes me as listening to your question and thinking about that, Timothy, is, we often talk about income inequality, but of course, wealth is even more stratified than that. And within wealth, the most stratified form of ownership of wealth is corporate stock. The amount of stock held by the richest 1% is equal to the amount of stock held by the bottom 99% in our country. And now we've got these people who are not exactly on the far left of our political spectrum, like Larry Fink at BlackRock, who are making the same point that you just did, Timothy, that artificial intelligence is going to further concentrate the returns of the economy in the companies that own artificial intelligence. I think there's a window that we're in now where it's possible that some of the gains of AI could be captured by the intellectual property that's still in the head of workers. I heard an estimate the other day that at this point, roughly 30% of the institutional knowledge inside companies is accessible to AI, and that potentially that could get as high as 70%. But that still leaves some essential intellectual property inside the minds of workers. And I think the only way that those workers get compensated for that knowledge is through some form of employee ownership.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's all these propositions out there that go everywhere from some form of employee ownership. So whatever benefit the company gets from the application of AI, all the workers benefit in some way, shape, or form. And then going a step further and guaranteeing it that if your job gets removed because of AI, you're still vested in some way for the firm. And then there's the other argument, which is, let's have some kind of wealth tax on AI returns and set up a national investment fund like what they've done in Norway with the oil and gas benefits of the North Sea and created this massive sovereign wealth fund. There's another argument that goes that way. And I'm curious, your perspective on what the mechanism ought to be to try to help address that.
It's such a complicated issue. I don't know if I would trust any recommendation I would have. I do believe that it's hard to imagine a future economy in which AI is a large part that still has a viable middle class unless that economy involves a whole lot of employee ownership. So people share in the profitability of their businesses, not just wages.
So I think the employee ownership thing has become corrupted to some degree with stock options. Because I remember years ago looking at the data from Whole Foods, that at that time, 75% of stock options went to 5 people. The CEO, CFO, and a few others at the typical public company. And now at Whole Foods, I believe, if I remember, 93% of stock options went to ordinary employees, people working in the stores, the cashiers, and so forth. And over time, that was meaningful to those people. So I think, this idea, and I'm in Silicon Valley now, right? And I just had dinner the other night sitting next to a VC, and he talked about the son of one of his friends who 2 years out of college, he joined this company and now they just went public. And this kid who's 24 years old has $70 million in stock. Now, I said, is he like a genius, like a Nobel level genius? He said, no, he's a smart engineer. But so that's a distortion of our system, right? What is a 24-year-old, what has he possibly done in 2 years to accumulate that kind of wealth? So our system really is kind of a winner-take-all kind of a system, and it creates even more of the problems that we're talking about, the divisions and the haves and haves not. I think there's like a caste system in most companies, where you have the executives and then you have the people actually doing the work, the hourly workers or whatever they might be, depending on the industry. And life is dramatically different for them and their prospects are dramatically different. And I think what we're talking about here is really sharing the wealth and sharing the prosperity so that everybody has a good life, and not some people sort of a gargantuan payday and then other people have nothing, right? So I think that's more of a comment than a question, perhaps. But if you want to say something.
Right on. I agree. I mean, it is so in my mind, one of the 3 criteria for what really makes something employee owned is that it's broad based. So I think that I've got no problem with people getting rich. I think they should get rich. I think people who have a great idea and work really hard should do well in the economy. But I thought the best explanation for why employee ownership made sense comes from a Dilbert cartoon where they're headed off to Albonia to explain how capitalism works. And the idea was, so if you have a really great idea and if you work really, really hard and if you get lucky, then maybe your boss will get rich. And I think the idea is just what you said, Raj. Why not all of us get rich? Our member companies describe this as it's not a get-rich-quick scheme; it's a get-rich-slow scheme. It's a way for instead of creating a billionaire, let's create 1,000 millionaires. And some of our companies use that as a slogan for how they think about employee ownership.
Yeah, it's an interesting point because, we started off with the discussion for the business case. Look, there's a clear business case. And then once you've got that business case, the question becomes, how does that value that gets created get distributed? And then it becomes an issue that starts to raise the bigger flag, which is there's a lot of people talking about the fact that 70 or 80% of Americans don't feel they're participating in capitalism today. And as we look at, half the people under the age of 35 believing in socialism, and we've got this other number of people who feel they're not participating in capitalism, we have a crisis, emerging around the legitimacy of capitalism. Now, we argue you need to elevate the practice of capitalism. There's no other mechanism in the history of humankind that's worked as well for organizing resources to solve problems and issues as capitalism. And the practice can be elevated. And I definitely, put a stake in the ground that employee ownership is a part of that elevation of the practice of capitalism. Because if we don't do it, the social implications of this over time with this kind of inequality never ends well.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's interesting. We get staffers from both parties and members of Congress and senators from both parties strongly supporting employee ownership. And I'll always remember at one conference in D.C. a couple of years back, one staffer quoted Marx and how employee ownership can address some of the needs that Marx raised. And another scholar quoted Ronald Reagan about how employee ownership could build a stronger capitalism. And the interesting thing was, it was a Democratic staffer that quoted Reagan and a Republican staffer that quoted Marx. And that's always stuck with me. So I think that gets to the interesting point you're raising, Timothy, which goes all the way back to Senator Russell Long, who was the conservative Louisiana Democrat who made sure we had employee ownership legislation in the country. And he can sound really conservative half the time and really liberal half the time.
So I'm always curious, what's the argument politically for why we aren't trying to structure things to make this easier and easier? Because I get the sense that you guys have been fighting a sort of an uphill battle for a while about getting legislatures to step in here and think about this we need to make more of this and we need to make it easier. What's going on in that world? Where does that opposition come from?
Yeah. There is barely any opposition in in Congress. I'd say the challenges at a policy level to employee ownership have mostly been inside the regulatory agencies. And that's partly because the main form of employee ownership, ESOPs, is under retirement plan law. And retirement plan law is inherently and justifiably very conservative about protecting the interest of retirement plan participants. So I think it's almost a culture of caution that grew up largely inside the Department of Labor. And I actually think that has largely changed. And again, not to make this a partisan issue, it changed dramatically under the Assistant Secretary of Labor under the Biden administration, and it's continued in the Trump administration.
Loren, where does unionization play into this? Do you see any patterns of companies that are more unionized or less unionized or not unionized going towards this, or what's the overlap or interaction?
It's pretty messy, and it's union by union. There are some unions that have been very interested in using employee ownership as a strategy, building it into their bargaining with the companies where they have an agreement, and then other unions have chosen to focus instead on more traditional benefits, especially pensions. So I'd say it's a really mixed bag. We have a number of member companies that are unionized, but there are also a lot of unionized companies that don't have and don't seem to be interested in employee ownership.
The other thought I had was that this is in a way, part of conscious capitalism, right? Treating your employees like stakeholders and taking that to ownership is really tangibilizing the idea of being a stakeholder. Would you say that companies that have adopted this then it's kind of the adjacent possible, right? That they are now already thinking about employees as stakeholders. What about customers as stakeholders? What about suppliers as stakeholders? And when you see the benefits of doing it for employees, you actually start to see benefits of doing that same thing, not from an ownership standpoint, but just from feeling connected and like you have a stake in the business. So I'm just thinking aloud whether
Yeah.
the couple of thousand companies that you have are all conscious capitalists without knowing it, and whether they would be likely to want to go further on that journey.
A lot of our member companies do engage their employees in having warm, mutual relations with the customers and the vendors they work with. And they also, again, no data on this, but anecdotally, they are much more likely to be involved in charitable and activities inside their communities and other community-focused activities. So although I can't give you a data-based answer, Raj, I do think you're right. I think that the practice of thinking beyond simple maximization of profit to a longer term, deeper, more multidimensional approach to how the company works is pretty common among our members.
And I want to give a shout out right now to a couple of our members. Rob Connolly, who's stepped down from our board, was the former CEO of Henny Penny, which is a 100% employee-owned business and an amazing example of a high-performing conscious capitalist business. I want to call out Torani. If any of you have had flavored coffee, Melanie Del Becco, the CEO there, they're a third employee-owned, and again, been growing at 15, 20% every year for the last 20 years under her leadership. And then finally, Miran Oka of Oka Aquatics, a $10 million, employee-owned business through an employee trust for swim schools, and how that has really changed and the trajectory of her business in a very positive way. So this connection between some of your folks and some of our folks is a deep one. Now, having said that, Loren, we promised that we would end with our quick and rapid, Raj-based fun questions, or at least deep and interesting, right, Raj? Fun or deep and interesting? Wow. Over to you, buddy.
Not so deep, actually, but definitely interesting. So, Loren, is there a book that shaped how you think about work or ownership or leadership?
There's a very quirky one, which is hard to find, but it's called Paradoxes of Leadership, and it's by a mentor of mine, Charles Edmondson. He wrote this when he had a terminal disease, so he was summing up several decades of leadership in actually both in the church and in an employee-owned company, and he put together some of the wisest, pithiest statements I've heard about how to be an effective leader.
The second question relates to that. Is there a leader that you admire greatly for practicing genuine stewardship, and would that be the same person or somebody else?
I certainly admire Charles for that, but I think the person I would single out is Corey Rosen, who's the founder of the National Center for Employee Ownership, and he has done one of the trickiest possible things, which is he and I did our transition, so I became the chief executive 15 years ago, and he still works every day. It's hard to imagine somebody who better exemplifies the effective yet humble leadership skills that he does.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Is there a company that you wish more people knew about that doesn't get the recognition that it should?
This is just not quite a direct answer to your question, Raj, but I think we've got those, got nearly 2,000 company members, and I think all of them are companies that people don't generally hear of unless they do business with them directly. They're more often B2B companies, and I think all of those have the kind of stories that would address that appalling statistic that you had earlier, Timothy, about how many people feel like this economy is not for them, that they're excluded from this economy. I think all of those companies would give people a counter narrative to that narrative of us all being excluded from the economy.
Maybe there needs to be a chicken soup or the soul book coming out of those.
I like that idea. Let's do that.
A bunch of stories.
Yeah.
What is the best advice you ever received?
So the best advice I ever received was that I think it's LBJ who said this, that the best way to get things done is to not need the credit.
And what is the worst business advice that you hear too often?
That it's all about maximizing shareholder value.
Is there a favorite story or a moment from one of your conferences?
We started a practice that I hope we can continue of having the Department of Labor, representatives from the Department of Labor come to our conferences and just hear directly stories from employee owners. And I would have a really hard time picking a single story, but some of those have been just so compelling. People who were literally sleeping in their car in the parking lot of a Walmart, got an internship, a temporary job at an employee-owned company, and now run a unit there. A person who left an employee-owned company because of a mental illness, was homeless on the street. By dumb luck, the CEO of the company ran into this person on the street and said, "Hey, you've got a 5-figure check waiting for you. Just come get it." So there are some transformative stories. And then some of my favorite stories are about an employee who had a transformative idea for the business. And maybe it's the janitor. Jack Stack, who's the CEO of Springfield Remanufacturing, often tells a story of getting a transformative idea literally from a janitor at the company. And I hear constant stories about whole companies setting up lines of business that nobody in the C-suite thought of. These are ideas from, actually to your prior point, Raj, people who are talking to the customers, and the customer said, "Gee, you do this. What if you did this too?"
Did you ever have Thomas Perez, the labor secretary under Obama, come to your events? Because he came to Conscious Capitalism once or twice,
You guys win then. No, he never came, but he did host a gathering for employee ownership at the White House, which he was a very gracious host.
And he hosted a couple of those on Conscious Capitalism as well at the White House. So,
you win again.
Not winning or losing. Complete this sentence. Capitalism would be healthier if
more people own parts of the economy.
And what is giving you hope right now?
The amazing passion and creativity and tireless effort I see among my colleagues at the National Center for Employee Ownership. Were 25 incredible people that I learned from every day. The same passion and energy among the members of our board of directors, among our membership as a whole, and among all the nonprofits that we collaborate with in this field to make it grow.
Wonderful. Thank you, Loren, for being with us.
Thank you, Raj.
And for the work that you do. Thank you. It's very important.
Thank you.
Yeah, I love it. And, there is such a close connection between us. Mary Joseph, who sits on our board, has been a longtime supporter with her organization, Verret Advisors, and, connected us again recently. So a shout out to Mary as well for making this possible. Loren, the work you're doing at NCEO in terms of making the business case and making the case is incredibly valuable to our economy and to our broader movement of conscious capitalism. So thank you for your dedication to doing that.
Thank you, Timothy, and thank you for your generosity in hosting me. I enjoyed this conversation and look forward to the next round of it.
All right. Thank you. And for those of you that are listening, if you enjoyed today's conversation on whatever channel you're listening, please feel free to hit the subscription button or go over to Spotify or iTunes on Apple and leave us a review. Give us a score. Tell us what you thought. We always love your feedback. And to Rainbow Productions for producing today's show, thank you. And to Conscious Capitalism, Inc., for being our sponsor for the program. Big shout out to you. And we will see you all next week.